All right, today's class is going to focus on the different ethical and cultural considerations you need to take into your research project, because this is something obviously we talk about in all of our social work classes, is that there's diversity in human society and we have the power to be culturally competent or to kind of be in a position of power that might intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against others and not have things then end up being ethical or fair to all. So we're going to look at different components. This particular slide or PowerPoint is going to be looking at some ethical considerations specifically around informed consent. And then we'll also be incorporating some of the ethical or the cultural discussions as well. So to start off, these are the learning objectives for the module as a whole. This video isn't going to cover them all, but today at the end of this online module, my goal is that you'll have developed an understanding of the importance of ethical and professional behavior within the context of research. So that's one of the CSWE competencies that this course focuses on, demonstrating ethical and professional behavior. So we're going to kind of flesh that out a little bit, what that looks like in the context of research. Learning how to design a study in an ethical manner, so talking about informed consent, study design. Those are going to be two really big pieces because it's going to get you started and give you something tangible to work on in regards to your research project. And then we're going to incorporate looking at different characteristics of a culturally competent social work researchers and understanding the impact culture has on the research process as a whole. So that's kind of what we aim to do today through different learning activities. So to start out, why are research ethics important? I mentioned in the last slide that it is one of the CSWE competencies that gets measured in this class. And so the educational body has identified that making sure BSW students develop a competency in this, it's very important. Out of all the things that we could be teaching you, they've identified having ethical and professional behavior as one of the most important. It really demonstrates that it's something we have to take serious and make sure that we are all aware of and are doing our due diligence to be able to implement. So there's 5 different areas that the book identified, and they're all very valid. The first one is ethics are important because it promotes the aims of research, such as expanding knowledge. And so research isn't done usually just for funsies and something that, oh, I'm bored, I'm going to do research. No, maybe. Maybe that is something that you do, but not to this extent. Typically isn't promoted out of boredom, but it is definitely helping promote kind of one of those goals and tenets of social work is to promote knowledge and make sure things are evidence-based and that any sort of intervention or program that's implemented is valid and has, I guess, validity around it. It's not really the word I was looking for, but that's the word we're going for. So that's number 1. Number 2, it supports the values required for collaborative work, such as mutual respect and fairness. So, sorry to break it to some of you, but social work, you are going to be working with not just your clients, but you're going to have coworkers, really any job. It's hard to do social work in a silo. You have to have other people because supervision is part of it. It's a very collaborative field. And so it's already teaching you skills on how to interact with others in a way that builds that mutual respect and fairness. And so we're teaching you those skills right now to help set up that kind of professional development piece. Ethics do hold researchers accountable for their actions, and so making sure they're not going rogue or doing something that's going to harm the client or the profession or society as a whole. It ensures that public can trust research. This is a huge thing that kind of came out of the COVID era is what can people trust that's being reported? There's a lot of distrust with the media, with reports like vaccinations or even the severity of COVID or the source of COVID. Should we social distance? Should we shut businesses down? There was a lot of misinformation being shared during this time, and I think that there's kind of this cloud of mistrust around public information. And so if we can incorporate and demonstrate ethical research, that could then go to build trust back. And then ethics in research support social work and moral values of do no harm. And so having ethical principles tied into research does protect clients as well as the researchers themselves. So a lot of these I feel like are very like, of course, this is something that we do as a social worker, but you have to be aware that these are existing. You can't assume that everybody who's doing research abides by this or has that sort of moral and value base instilled in them. All right, so here is our crispy nugget for the first one for this class. The responsibility for not hurting any of your research participants is squarely on your shoulders. And so if you ever have spent time in the Code of Ethics, the language throughout the document is saying that, like, if you deviate from maybe one of the codes, so like having a dual relationship in some shape or form, it always puts this caveat on there saying it's on the responsibility of the social worker if any harm comes to the client. And so that's really the same philosophy in social work research, that if any harm befalls the client, you have to assume the responsibility. Now, there obviously, if you've done all of your things, you've given them informed consent, you've created an ethically safe research study, and yet there's some sort of harm that's inevitable or it's manufactured by the client, then obviously there's not necessarily that responsibility for the client or for the researcher, because you've put all those safeguards in place. And that's why we have those safeguards, that if a client decides to accuse you of something that's not factual as a result of the study, having followed an ethical procedure will have kept you safe from malpractice, lawsuits, or all those types of fun things. And so when you're thinking about harm, obviously you want to make sure there's no psychological harm or physical harm, financial, social harm, like those types of pieces, because you have a power as the researcher to manipulate, to gain someone's trust, and then utilize that to your advantage in a very sketchy way. I'd hope none of you would do that, but we're humans, and that's part of human nature. So I think another takeaway that thinking about this crispy nugget is that the participant safety always comes first and your research project comes second. So maybe after you've created a wonderful survey asking college students about their mental health and well-being, and you find that one question on there tends to trigger tearfulness every time, and every time you ask that question, regardless who the person is, they start talking about maybe suicidal ideations. And so you're wondering, is this really the best question to ask? Because am I equipped to help them if it triggers some sort of feeling? And then you maybe have to scrap it. This is hypothetical, by the way, and kind of dramatic. But let's say that happened. You would then have to evaluate, is this safe for me to be asking college students if I'm not equipped to help process X, Y, or Z? So please keep this in mind in whatever you do, that you are responsible for your client's safety, and ultimately any harm will come back to you. All right, this is the big piece of this lecture, is informed consent, because for our studies, we have to create an informed consent. One of the reasons we try to teach this class after you've taken individuals and family is because we spend a significant amount of time talking about informed consent in individuals and families, really going back to the fact that the clients have to know what they're getting into and then make an informed decision based on the information. And so anytime you involve a human in a research study, you must obtain informed consent. And the best way you should really do it is through a document that they sign and date. Because one of the things you'll find in social work, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So you might have a client verbally agree to it, and then down the road, they're like, nope, I never said that, even though they did. And then they're accusing of that there's been harm done because of the things, though that falls on to the researcher, even though you got a verbal agreement. If it's not documented, it did not happen. That is a rule of thumb whatever you do in social work. Anyways, so informed, simply put, means that all of your potential research participants must fully understand what's going on, why it's going to happen, what to expect, how it might affect them, how it might affect society as a whole. And they have to know that there might be risks involved, but there's also benefits. So all those fun things, we're actually going to go over those in the next slides. But the piece of paper, which we're going to talk about creating, the informed consent, needs to kind of encompass all of those things. So a person can honestly say when they sign their name on them, they understand what they're getting into. Now, you cannot use bribery. You cannot use threats. You cannot deceive them into signing something. And so those are those ethical pieces of like, do not bribe them, do not threaten them, do not tell them something bad is going to happen if they don't do it. You have to be above reproach and make sure this is something they're agreeing to based on thorough information. And then they can choose from there. Self-determination. There you go. All right, so there are 16 pieces of informed consent that you do need to be aware of when creating their form. So I'm going to move this a little bit because I think I have to catch all of that. Okay. All right. Oops. Steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to go through these, not super thoroughly because they're in the book, and this is just to introduce you to the concepts that you'll have to include, because once you start creating your study and getting more specifics, then you probably want to reference back to chapter 5 to kind of make sure you've got all these pieces. So 1, you have to let the participants know that they're being asked to be part of the study. So saying, we're conducting research, you're being asked. Like that one's, some of these are very duh. But yes, you have to tell them that they're being asked to be part of a study. Number 2, you have to make it clear that participation is voluntary, and at any point in the project, they are allowed to discontinue their involvement without penalty. It will not impact their services, their X, Y, or Z. They have the right to determine that. You have to make that explicitly clear. If you withhold that information, that could be looked at as a piece of coercion because you're not letting them, they might feel then obligated to stay even if they're uncomfortable. You want to make sure you list the names of the investigators and their affiliates. So students at Kuiper College, that is going to be who you guys are. And giving a really simply explained purpose of the study. One of the things you want to avoid in informed consent is using very verbose and scientific and technical language, because it might lend to your participants not fully understanding what they're getting into. So you want to keep it as basic and simple as possible so that anybody, regardless of their literacy, their education level, their focus, or whatever element, is able to understand what the purpose of the study is. Number 5, how the study is going to be implemented. What are the procedures? What can they expect? Number 6, how long will this survey be going on? Obviously, for the sake of this class, it's going to be rather short. It might just be a one-time application survey because we're not really implementing anything and we're just exploring information. So this one, but if this was something where you were going to follow adults with schizophrenia for a year, then they would have to know doing this for a year. Number 7, you want to outline any reasonably foreseeable risks or discomforts. And so if you're talking about asking questions about mental health, you might want to preface that this might trigger uncomfortable emotions or something. You don't want to go into too much depth and scare them, but you have to be aware and let them know that there might be some risk. And then you need to say if there's any safeguards to minimize the risk. So for college students, most college campuses have their students are able to access free counseling, or at least some sort of counseling services. So that would be something you maybe want to identify, that in the event that this caused some sort of physical or mental distress, this is who to follow up with. Number 9, you want to make sure they know that there's benefits to it, because otherwise, why the heck are they doing it? And so often these studies aren't going to benefit the person directly because you're collecting information and trying to figure something out for future people who might have similar issues going on. So you kind of want to highlight that it is for the greater good and it will benefit society as a whole. Number 10, if there is some sort of incentive attached to it, it is appropriate to say like, hey, you can have a gift card, or like, if you come to this event, you can have a donut. So just outlining that. Appropriate alternative procedures or courses of treatment if harm does befall them. That's similar to the other one. If there's any confidential information that you obtain, how that will be stored and kept confidential. Any restrictions on confidentiality, that kind of goes back to what we talked about in individuals and family. Kind of what monetary compensation or psychological treatment will be provided if there's risk. Contact information about questions for the study. Do not give your personal information, but give them something, and then letting them know that they can have a